Frankfurt Airport, Germany, was busy early in the morning. The hustle and bustle of people planning their destinations spread everywhere, with announcements blaring over loudspeakers and travelers moving from one place to another. The atmosphere was full of life, but among the crowd there was a discreet, almost imperceptible presence. In the check-in line, a man was standing silently, calmly observing the movement in front of him. He was Marco Reus, the famous football player for the German national team, but at that moment he seemed like nothing more than a simple traveler. Wearing a simple casual ensemble and a worn backpack, Marco stood out for his humility. It was difficult to believe that the man in front of him, so calm and collected, was one of the most talented and recognized athletes in world football. He wasn't boasting about his fame. There were no flashbulbs or fans around. Just an ordinary man going about his routine with a kind smile on his face. Beside him, a middle-aged man with a refined appearance was observing everything with a look of superiority. His name was Edward Calloway. He was a successful businessman in Frankfurt, known for his business astuteness and luxurious lifestyle. His well-tailored suit, impeccable leather shoes, and gold watch on his wrist betrayed his position in society. Calloway, as usual, observed the people around him with an air of disdain. He couldn't help but notice Marco's figure, who was there, in the same check-in line, seemingly so carefree. Something about that contrast bothered him, as if Marco's presence was a mistake, an oversight in the universe of perfection that he so admired. With an ironic smile, Calloway looked at Marco, and just like that, he said, still with that affable tone, but full of sarcasm, "It looks like someone made a mistake. You know this flight is for first class, right? This kind of style, let's say, doesn't seem to be compatible with the place, don't you think?" Marco, who had listened to the words calmly, stopped for a moment. He looked at the businessman and, although surprised, did not change his behavior. That kind of comment wasn't new to him, but he still decided to be polite. With a slight smile, he replied softly, "No, that's right. It's all right." Edward, for a moment, seemed confused by the answer. He thought he should provoke more, that perhaps Marco wasn't understanding the irony of his speech, but instead, he continued to strike up a conversation, more on impulse than out of real interest. "Well, first class isn't cheap at all, you know. It must be difficult for someone simple like you to get used to a place like this. There are many privileges, don't you think?" Marco once again maintained his smile, a serene and calm expression. He didn't respond immediately, but remained silent for a few seconds, observing the man in front of him. Then, finally, he said, in the same calm voice, "I appreciate your concern, but my ticket is valid. Everything is in order." Edward Calloway, surprised by Marco's lack of provocation, didn't know what to think. What could have been a game of power and superiority became a strange conversation, where he couldn't understand exactly who the calm and silent man in front of him was. Edward Calloway observed Marco Reus's simple set of clothes and worn backpack with a disdainful look. To him, it seemed like a mistake. A person with a backpack like that definitely shouldn't be in the first-class queue. His mind continued to make quick judgments, and the words came out of his mouth impetuously. "In my opinion, a person carrying a backpack like this would be more suited to economy class than first class," he said, with a tone that did not disguise his arrogance. Calloway's words were becoming increasingly rude, but Marco, once again, was unfazed. He remained calm, as if nothing had happened. He looked at the man beside him, a soft, peaceful smile on his face. "That's not true. I am exactly where I chose to be, and I am satisfied," Marco replied, his voice calm as always, while his backpack took its place beside him without any sign of discomfort. Edward was surprised by the answer. He didn't expect Marco, seemingly so ordinary, to be so firm. The answer not only caught him off guard, but also left him a little angry. He felt like he didn't get the answer he wanted, but at the same time, he didn't want to miss the chance to continue his conversation. Yes, of course," Edward muttered, still visibly irritated, but trying to hide it. His face expressed a mixture of dissatisfaction and contempt, but Marco didn't seem to care at all. The line moved slowly until it was time for Marco to approach the check-in counter. He handed his passport and ticket to the staff, who looked at him with a smile. The employee looked at Marco's name, quickly confirmed the details, and, with a genuine smile, said, "It's an honor to help you. Have a good trip, Mr. Reus." Edward, who was watching everything closely, couldn't hide his surprise. Marco Reus's name sounded familiar, but he couldn't immediately remember where he knew him. Your brain tried to make the connection, but it couldn't. Recognition came just a few seconds later, and it was as if a flash of understanding had ignited. He wasn't just anyone. Marco Reus was one of the greatest football players in the world, a global icon. Edward looked at the smartphone in his hand and searched for Marco Reus's name. What he found left him speechless. The simple, seemingly unostentatious man standing there before him was a world-renowned celebrity. He felt completely embarrassed, a heat of embarrassment rising to his face as he reflected on how he had treated Marco with such arrogance. After that, Edward was silent. He felt embarrassed, remembering his own rudeness and the foolish words he had spoken. He looked around, but Marco had already walked away, putting away his backpack and heading towards the boarding area. Marco, however, continued his journey like any other passenger. He went to the departure lounge, where he would wait for his flight. Without attracting attention, without any sign of ostentation, he was just another person among the others, living that moment with the same simplicity he had always had, far from the spotlight and fame. The flight departing from Frankfurt was destined for Seoul, South Korea. Marco sat in first class, with a spacious and comfortable seat. He relaxed, his backpack at his side, as the plane began to taxi down the runway. The atmosphere in first class seemed to be more tense than usual. People seemed so distant, immersed in their own routines and worries. But Marco didn't care. He wasn't there to impress anyone, just to follow his path. However, Edward Calloway, now in his seat next to Marco, seemed unable to put the situation behind him. "Look, it looks like even people like you can now be in first class," Edward said, trying to ease the tension with a mocking smile, but with a tone full of disdain. His voice echoed the idea that Marco, somehow, didn't deserve to be there. Marco looked at Edward for a moment. His response was calm, almost imperceptible, but full of unspoken meanings. He just looked at the man next to him, maintaining his calming posture and smile. Marco Reus looked at Edward Calloway, but his expression didn't seem angry or confused. It was just a calm and serene smile. Edward's arrogance was clearly visible, but Marco was not willing to react in kind. "If you think so, the ticket price must have dropped a lot," Marco replied, looking calmly out the plane window. Edward was amused by Marco's calm attitude. Feeling the gazes of the passengers around him, he raised his voice intentionally, trying to attract attention. "Where did you get that old backpack? Did you get it for free, or—" He laughed disdainfully, seeking to humiliate. "I bought it at the flea market," Marco replied with a voice full of laughter and mockery, keeping his tone light but without giving in to the provocation. The passengers around Marco began to look at each other, with some expressions of discomfort, but no one dared to intervene. Some turned their heads or covered their ears silently, trying to ignore the uncomfortable situation, but Marco was unfazed. He shook his head, listening to Edward's words without letting it affect him. When he finally responded, his voice was simple and direct. "This backpack is very old, but I'm very attached to it as I've been using it for a long time. The value of an item is not in its appearance, but in the time we spend with it." Marco's answer, simple and calm, made complete sense. Edward was momentarily speechless. He wanted to retort, but something in Marco's calm posture stopped him from continuing the attack. However, he soon found a new target for his words. I think you're smart, but people like you shouldn't be where they belong. Shouldn't you be in economy class?" Edward said, trying to provoke him again, with a sneer on his face. Marco didn't hesitate, smiling kindly but not showing any sign of hesitation. "My actions and attitudes are more important than where I am. What defines a person is not the class they travel in, but who they are," Marco said, his voice still calm without wavering. The passengers around Edward, who were listening, were visibly impressed by Marco's posture. Edward, however, seemed even more uncomfortable, not knowing how to react. It was then that the flight attendant approached, noticing the growing tension between the two passengers. She looked at Edward, who was clearly dissatisfied, and asked in a soft tone, "What's the matter, sir? Please let me know if you need any help." Edward, feeling that the situation was becoming increasingly uncomfortable, pointed at Marco, trying to justify himself. "I feel bad about this person. He is behaving inappropriately for a first-class passenger." His voice was more aggressive, now completely without the facade of friendliness. The flight attendant looked at Marco, surprised, but Marco, without losing his composure, just smiled and shook his head. "No, there is no problem. We were just talking, nothing more," he said, trying to ease the tension. The flight attendant, realizing that the situation was not as serious as Edward wanted to suggest, carefully backed away, not wanting to make things worse. But the tension in the cabin was palpable. The surrounding passengers, although discreet, began to murmur, some expressing discomfort at Edward's attitude, others impressed by Marco's calmness. A man in the background shook his head slightly and muttered softly, "It's a shame to see this." His voice was low, but enough for Edward to hear. Edward felt his face flush with embarrassment. He knew his words were wrong, and that his attitude had upset the other passengers. Instead of admitting his failure, he latched on to one last attempt at an attack. "Did you ever work at an airport before going public with Sun Heung-min?" he snapped, his voice now closer to an insult. "You are a burden. If that's your job, your backpack explains it all." Edward's words were no longer just mockery, but direct and disrespectful attacks. However, Marco, maintaining his composure, calmly looked at him and replied, "I think a person's value is something that comes from within. We are not defined by our work or the things we own. I hope you realize this," Marco said, his voice firm and calm. Marco's response was not only a lesson for Edward, but for everyone around him. Some passengers nodded discreetly, admiring the way Marco handled the situation. Edward, on the other hand, was speechless, blushing in embarrassment. He couldn't continue the conversation. The cabin grew quieter, the tension slowly dissipating. Marco's calm demeanor caused him to leave a lasting impression, not only on Edward, but on all the passengers around him. Even if for a brief moment, his patience and integrity had been noticed. The flight continued without major incident, but inside that plane, an unforgettable lesson was being taught. The cabin was dimly lit, with flight attendants moving silently as they prepared the in-flight meals. The atmosphere in business class and first class had a feeling of exclusivity, but the environment was even quieter than usual. Edward Calloway, sitting next to Marco Reus, couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort. His comments, which had previously seemed provocative, now became more rude, as if his voice needed to be heard despite his growing embarrassment. He looked at Marco, smiling cynically, and said, "Hey, people like you shouldn't be here. This is hilarious. Did you win the lottery or something?" He spoke in an observational tone, hoping his mockery would be well received. Some passengers around pretended not to hear, but the tension in the cabin increased as the silence was broken by Edward's words. Marco Reus, however, remained calm, showing that he was causing discomfort, but without doing anything to further intensify the situation. He replied with a soft smile without getting flustered, "Believe it or not, I bought this backpack at the flea market. It's old, but it has value to me. The value of something is not in its appearance, but in the use we give it." Marco's simple answer seemed to make sense to some passengers around, but Edward was not satisfied. Feeling that he was being ignored, he intensified his provocation. "Ah, so that's it. Must be a football player or something. But as far as I know, famous athletes don't use such ugly bags." At this moment, the flight attendant approached with a friendly expression, bringing the meals on board for the passengers. She, upon hearing Marco's voice, stopped for a moment and was visibly surprised to recognize him. "You are Marco Reus, aren't you?" she asked with a radiant smile on her face. Several passengers around started to pay attention, and Marco, with a slightly embarrassed smile, replied, "That's right. Thank you for recognizing me." His voice was sincere and warm, which made the passengers around him feel even more at ease. The flight attendant, visibly excited, continued the conversation. "My son loves you. He always watches Bundesliga games and he can't stop talking about you. I'm a big fan." As the conversation unfolded, other passengers began to notice who was sitting next to Edward. Some took out their cell phones, discreetly asking to take photos of Marco. Edward, on the other hand, was visibly uncomfortable, his expression starting to show discomfort. He avoided eye contact and seemed increasingly embarrassed as he realized that the person he had ridiculed was, in fact, a global celebrity. The flight attendant, still excited, continued praising Marco. He was being treated with kindness, and words of gratitude began to spread among the passengers. Everyone was touched by Marco's humble attitude, who continued to maintain his calm without letting the situation affect him. But Edward, upon realizing how wrong his posture was, felt a weight in his chest. He tried to ignore the situation, but his mind was filled with regret. He looked out the window, trying to hide from his embarrassment, but Marco's words began to echo in his mind. The plane continued its journey, and the passengers, now more uncomfortable with the tension, calmed down. Marco, unfazed, put on his headphones and relaxed, listening to music, while Edward was still tense, feeling like an intruder in his own space. Finally, Edward couldn't take it anymore. After some time of reflection, he turned to Marco, shame written all over his face, and said, I'm really sorry. I didn't know who you were, and I was very rude. I was hasty in my words and judgment." His voice was full of regret, and he was trying to finally take responsibility. Marco, with his characteristic calm, looked at him and smiled softly. "Don't worry. Everything is fine. We all make mistakes. The important thing is to recognize and learn from them." Marco's response seemed to ease Edward's heart a little, who now understood the depth of what he had done. He could no longer hide his shame, and at the same time, he was grateful for Marco's generosity. During that flight, he learned a valuable lesson about judgment, humility, and respect for people no matter their position or appearance. The surrounding passengers were also touched, and the atmosphere inside the plane began to change. Marco's words echoed among them, and many began to reflect on their own attitudes and prejudices. Edward, with a sincere look, apologized again, and Marco, with his calm smile, replied, "Life is like that. We are all just people trying to do our best. The important thing is how we treat each other." With Marco's words, the flight approached its destination, and Edward, although still full of shame, felt as if he was leaving the experience a little better, more reflective, and more aware of his own mistakes. The plane landed smoothly, and the passengers stood up, grabbing their bags and preparing to leave. Edward, still weighed down by his shame, looked at Marco one last time. Marco, with his serene smile, waved at him, saying, "I hope your next trip is lighter and happier." Edward, touched by Marco's kindness, just nodded. He knew that experience would stay with him forever, as a lesson he would never forget. As the passengers exited the plane, they talked about Marco's attitude, impressed by his humility and respect. Edward, with one last look at Marco, reflected on his life and felt grateful to have been part of something so simple, yet so transformative.